The morning my marriage ended, I felt hollow. Weeks later, I uncovered a black card and a hidden trust that made me untouchable. Suddenly, I could rebuild, influence, and strike without being seen. But watching those who ruined me squirm was intoxicating, terrifying, and dangerous. At the beginning of 2012, I woke up in my small, worn apartment on the edge of Atlanta. The city outside was gray and damp, the air carrying the scent of wet asphalt and rain-soaked streets. Inside, the smell of old coffee lingered, mixed with the stale dust that had accumulated over years of neglect. Morning light seeped weakly through the blinds, cutting thin lines across the worn wooden floor. On the kitchen table, I found the divorce papers, neatly stacked, sterile and precise, as if someone had anticipated this exact moment, as if my absence had already been orchestrated. Each sheet felt like a verdict, stripping away the pretense of comfort and familiarity. I moved through the apartment in a strange half-daze, gathering what I could carry: my laptop, a few essential documents, personal items that still felt tethered to who I once was, and a handful of photographs that now seemed to belong to someone else. The apartment, once filled with shared memories, laughter, and the mundane clutter of daily life, had become a hollow shell. The walls echoed with the absence of sound, amplifying every movement I made, every small scrape of a shoe against the floorboards. I could feel the weight of emptiness pressing into my chest, thick and suffocating, as if the air itself had grown heavy with loss. It was not only the collapse of a marriage that I was confronting, but the sudden erosion of my identity, the subtle unraveling of a life that had once seemed permanent. As I packed, the world outside moved on with indifferent rhythm, unaware of the quiet disintegration inside my apartment. The sense of loss was paired with an odd liberation, a fragile, hollow freedom that left my mind both relieved and aching. It was as if the life I had known, the version of myself built over years of compromise and shared routines, had evaporated in a single morning, leaving a blank space where certainty used to be. Every object I touched, every folded paper, every photograph, seemed to whisper reminders of what had been and what I no longer belonged to. The stillness around me became almost tangible, pressing against my skin, embedding itself into my awareness. I felt the slow, cold clarity of realization that my existence had been recalibrated, that the coordinates of my daily life had shifted overnight. The apartment was quiet, almost reverently so, yet every corner seemed to hum with absence, a presence defined by what was no longer there. And in that silence, a strange seed of awareness took root. I had lost everything familiar, yet somehow I was still standing, still capable of walking out into the uncertain light of a new day. A few weeks later, I found myself sifting through the remnants of my mother's life. The home she had left behind a year ago, now quiet and heavy with the weight of absence. Her belongings had been untouched since her passing, stacked neatly as if she had expected someone to come looking one day to piece together what she had quietly preserved. I opened drawers and cabinets, lifted lids, and carefully turned over objects coated with a thin layer of dust. It was in the back of a tall, crooked bookshelf, hidden behind stacks of yellowed books that no one had touched in decades, that I discovered the small metal case. It was cold and heavy in my hands, unremarkable except for the care with which it had been hidden, the sense that it was meant for someone who would understand its purpose. Inside lay a black card embossed with my name, a thick envelope, and a series of documents detailing a trust that my mother had meticulously maintained over the years. As I studied the papers, I realized the enormity of what she had created. Wealth accumulated gradually, quietly, without spectacle. Investments in real estate, stocks, and bonds were mapped with precision. Each decision weighted against risk and projected for steady growth. It was a system of patience and foresight, a careful orchestration of capital that spanned decades. The more I read, the more I understood that this was not merely money. It was strategy, foresight, and protection all intertwined, a hidden network of security and power crafted to survive even the chaos of human failure. Visiting the bank in downtown Atlanta was the first step into this new reality, and it struck me immediately that this world operated differently. The staff glanced at me with a subtle apprehension, their eyes flicking over the black card and the envelope as if I had crossed an invisible threshold into a space where ordinary rules no longer applied. A manager, moving with quiet urgency, led me into a private office, its walls lined with folders and screens, the hum of security protocols almost tangible in the air. He explained nothing directly, yet everything about his manner made clear that the mechanisms of observation and control were far beyond what I had anticipated. It was as though my every action was now a potential trigger, each transaction capable of activating a cascade of alerts, a system silently waiting to respond to any deviation. Sitting at the polished desk, the black card lying before me, I felt the gravity of responsibility pressed down. Wealth, I realized, did not bring relief or liberation. It created a new framework of expectations and restrictions. Every decision now carried weight, every move had consequence, and the scope of accountability stretched far beyond anything I had known. I understood instinctively that this capital could be used to build, to protect, to influence. But it could also ensnare me, turning me into a pawn within the ambitions of others who might watch, who might interpret, who might act. As I left the bank, the city around me seemed sharper, its contours more defined, but also somehow more imposing. I walked past traffic, past the gray brick buildings and the late winter light reflecting off glass towers, aware that my own presence had changed. I was no longer just a man moving through familiar streets. I was a custodian of something far larger than myself, a guardian of a legacy that demanded both wisdom and restraint. The conflict within me grew, a quiet tension between the desire to act and the fear of being absorbed, of losing the self I still clung to in the face of this newfound authority. How could I use this wealth without becoming its prisoner? How could I assert influence without surrendering autonomy? The questions circled in my mind, relentless and insistent, and I realized that the answers would not come easily, that this hidden legacy was as much a test as it was a gift. I chose to move cautiously, deliberately stepping into the shadows of the city rather than announcing my arrival. I rented a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood of Atlanta, a place where the hum of traffic was distant and the faint rustle of leaves in the trees marked the passage of time. From the window, I could watch the city unfold without being seen, tracing patterns of movement, shifts in light, and the rhythm of daily life. It became a lens through which I could measure the pulse of the environment, a private observatory that allowed me to feel connected without revealing my presence. Within days, I found a derelict industrial property on the outskirts of the city, an empty shell of concrete and rusted steel, its walls scarred by years of neglect. It was a place that spoke of abandonment, of lost potential, and I saw in it a quiet opportunity. I purchased it without fanfare, without drawing attention, knowing that the transformation would be invisible to those who had no reason to look but profound to those who would eventually inhabit it. I began planning the reconstruction with meticulous care, not for maximum profit, but for the creation of a space that could shelter and sustain, a place where people could feel rooted and secure. The investment extended beyond bricks and mortar. I commissioned improvements that were subtle yet consequential, well-lit paths that guided movement without commanding attention, safe walkways that encouraged children and families to move freely, small green pockets that softened concrete expanses, and landscaping that marked the boundary between urban neglect and thoughtful care. Each decision was measured, discreet, and calculated to provide maximum impact without spectacle. It was a practice in restraint and precision, an exercise in shaping the environment while remaining unseen. I fortified the project legally and financially, using the trust to ensure confidentiality and to build barriers that could not be breached easily. Contracts were structured to protect the intention behind every investment, to prevent interference from outside parties who might misunderstand or exploit the work. I was learning to wield power quietly, to let influence grow not through display or assertion, but through careful placement, planning, and the patient orchestration of circumstances. Every document I signed, every financial decision I made, reinforced this invisible architecture of control. In the solitude of my apartment, I reflected on the paradox of power in the shadows. It was not about recognition, about being seen or celebrated. It was about shaping the conditions in which others lived, guiding outcomes without needing applause, and asserting authority through consequence rather than spectacle. The project became a laboratory of influence, a way to test how subtly one could alter the fabric of a community while remaining effectively anonymous. As days turned into weeks, I watched as minor changes began to ripple outward. Utility crews improved street lighting, contractors arrived at schedules I had arranged quietly, and the surrounding areas responded in ways that were barely perceptible but undeniably real. I was present and absent at the same time, a force without a face, a presence that could reshape space and circumstance without ever being called to account publicly. The quiet influence settled into my life as a principle. Power exercised subtly, deliberately, invisibly, but with tangible, lasting effect. By the time the first scaffolding was erected and the first walls were painted, I realized that control had entered my life not as a show of dominance, not as status to be flaunted, but as a tool for real impact. I had the ability to bend circumstance to intention, to create order, safety, and possibility where neglect had prevailed. And I understood for the first time that influence, when exercised without clamor or spectacle, was often more enduring and more profound than any public declaration could ever be. Months passed, and I began to notice patterns that had previously escaped my attention. My former wife, Claire, and her new partner, a rising entrepreneur with a polished image and carefully cultivated connections, seemed to watch my every move from a distance. It was subtle at first, a familiar glance across a crowded street, a fleeting presence near my projects. Rumors whispered in circles I had once occupied. Yet over time, the observation became unmistakable, an invisible pressure pressing against the edges of my new life. Their interest was not casual curiosity. It was a deliberate measure of control, an attempt to gauge the scope and scale of what I had built in silence. Offers arrived in muted forms: invitations to collaborate, proposals for joint ventures, opportunities disguised as reconciliations. Every suggestion carried a hidden price, a subtle calculus of social benefit and financial leverage. It became clear that the past had learned to speak in currency rather than sentiment, in influence rather than affection. The exchanges were not about shared history or emotional connection. They were negotiations of advantage, evaluations of utility. I recognized that what once held meaning had been replaced with transactions, and that the people who had once shared my life were now assessing my worth in terms of assets and networks rather than memories or loyalty. I resisted. I declined each overture with a precision that was almost ritualistic, a demonstration of control over my own narrative. I drew boundaries both tangible and intangible. I limited encounters, structured meetings to minimize unnecessary exposure, and insulated my personal life from prying eyes. Every action reinforced a simple principle: the past could observe, speculate, and attempt to influence, but it could not dictate the trajectory of my existence. My autonomy became a fortress, and each refusal was a stone in its walls. The emotional dimension was equally critical. I refused to be manipulated by guilt, nostalgia, or the faint echo of shared intimacy. I acknowledged the familiarity of the faces and the pull of old routines, but I refused to let them blur the distinction between what had been and what I now was. I was not seeking revenge, nor was I attempting to shame or punish. My measures were preventive, protective, a form of quiet assertion. The demonstration was of self-possession rather than aggression, an unspoken warning that my identity was no longer negotiable. In private, I reflected on the paradox of history. The people who had shaped my past were capable of exerting immense psychological weight, yet their power only existed as long as I allowed it. By constructing clear emotional and physical boundaries, I reclaimed the space my former life had threatened to encroach upon. I observed, I analyzed, I anticipated, but I did not yield. The sense of independence grew stronger with every interaction I declined. Every attempt to entangle me in familiar scripts I resisted. The experience also crystallized an internal understanding of influence. Power did not always present itself in public displays or grand gestures. Often, it resided in the subtle assertion of limits, in the consistent maintenance of agency over one's own decisions. By refusing to be instrumentalized in the schemes or ambitions of others, I reinforced the architecture of my autonomy. My life had become a measured projection of self-determination, a quiet declaration that past attachments, no matter how intimate, could no longer define my present or my future. As I walked through the city, moving between my renovated properties, the shadows of memory occasionally flickered across my mind, faint and distant. They reminded me of what had been of the roles I had once played, but their influence had been neutralized by deliberate choice and discipline. I had become both observer and executor of my own life, untethered from expectations and unburdened by the judgments of those who had once claimed a stake in my identity. Shadows remained, but they no longer dictated the contours of my days. They existed as background, a quiet reminder that independence is won not by force but by steady, unwavering resistance to intrusion. The months of vigilance and measured disengagement revealed another truth. Liberation was not only the absence of old attachments, but also the presence of clarity, of the ability to move through life without yielding to the pressures of inherited obligations or manipulated loyalties. Each refusal, each boundary, each moment of self-possession became part of a deliberate, invisible architecture of freedom. I had learned that real influence begins with mastering the limits of one's own involvement. That true strength lies not in confrontation, but in the unwavering maintenance of autonomy, and that the shadows of the past could serve as guides rather than chains, if one chose to observe without surrendering. The memory of my mother and the careful strategies she had employed throughout her life lingered in my mind, shaping the way I viewed influence and responsibility. I began to see wealth not merely as a personal advantage, but as a tool for systemic impact, a way to create change that would extend beyond individual transactions or fleeting achievements. With my younger sister, I initiated a foundation dedicated to supporting single mothers, providing training, professional skills, and access to resources that could help break cycles of poverty and dependence. The work was meticulous and deliberate, designed to be effective without drawing attention to itself. There were no flashy campaigns, no public announcements. Every program, every training session, every small grant was calibrated to produce tangible, measurable outcomes. I watched quietly as women who had struggled to maintain stability began to gain confidence, their lives gradually shifting in ways that were visible only to those paying close attention. Stories emerged slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A mother returning to school after years of stagnation, a young woman launching a small business, children experiencing stability for the first time in years. Each success reinforced the quiet architecture of the foundation, proof that thoughtful, systemic interventions could yield results far more profound than any headline or publicity stunt. Meanwhile, I continued to invest in the redevelopment project, but my priorities had shifted. Profit was no longer the sole metric of success. Instead, I focused on creating an environment where people felt safe, where streets were well lit, paths were secure, and green spaces offered respite and connection. I designed each building and public space to foster a sense of belonging, not merely to maximize returns. It was a form of quiet influence, shaping the city not with spectacle but with substance. The invisible scaffolding of my investments created stability and opportunity in a way that could be sustained long after my personal involvement diminished. Each day, I moved through my responsibilities with a sense of alignment that I had never known before. Decisions were measured, deliberate, and guided by a sense of purpose rather than impulse. Legal structures were maintained with precision, financial oversight was strict but unobtrusive, and the community felt the benefits without needing to understand the source. The balance of discretion and impact created a rhythm of control that was deeply satisfying. I felt a quiet power in knowing that the actions I took mattered, that they would ripple outward in ways neither I nor anyone else could fully predict. There was also an internal peace that accompanied this work. In the past, control had been synonymous with visibility, with dominance or recognition. Now, control meant shaping the environment in ways that were invisible to most, creating conditions for others to thrive while remaining intentionally discreet. The satisfaction was subtler, more enduring, watching tangible progress emerge from deliberate effort, knowing that the structures I built would support lives beyond the immediate moment, and feeling that my influence had become constructive rather than coercive. With each project completed, with each life touched through the foundation, I felt a profound sense of harmony between action and intention. The city itself seemed to shift under my quiet guidance. Streets once neglected became corridors of safety and opportunity. Vacant lots transformed into gardens or community spaces, and residents began to express a newfound confidence in the future. My role was not to dominate, but to enable, to create the conditions for stability and growth. The daily experience of measured influence reinforced my own self-possession, instilling a calm sense of authority rooted not in external acknowledgement, but in the knowledge that I was shaping a meaningful and lasting legacy. By the end of the year, the results were undeniable. The Foundation's programs were producing consistent, measurable improvements in the communities we served. The redevelopment project had created neighborhoods where people felt respected and protected. And I, too, had changed. I felt a groundedness and resilience that no external accolade could replicate. Each day brought clarity. Each decision reinforced autonomy, and each accomplishment, however quiet, became a testament to the alignment of intention, action, and enduring impact. I had learned that creation was not about spectacle or recognition. It was about building systems, shaping lives, and leaving behind a framework for growth and security that would endure long after my presence became invisible. The redevelopment project was finally complete, the buildings inhabited by families who had once lived in cramped, unsafe conditions, now filling the apartments with laughter, movement, and the quiet hum of daily life. Walking through the streets of the transformed neighborhood, I observed the small, almost imperceptible signs of renewal. Children riding bikes along clean sidewalks, elderly neighbors chatting on benches under newly planted trees, streetlights casting even, comforting illumination across pathways that had once been neglected and shadowed. The foundation I had built with my sister was now tangible, its influence visible in local schools, community centers, and workplaces where opportunities were beginning to shift lives. Externally, I lived as I had before, quiet and unobtrusive, blending into the rhythms of the city. Internally, I was entirely transformed. The weight of past humiliations and personal betrayals no longer shaped my identity. I no longer sought approval or recognition, and wealth had become a tool rather than a tether. Money no longer dictated my choices, and the relentless pursuit of status had been replaced by the deliberate act of creation and stewardship. I moved through the world with a sense of calm authority, a confidence rooted not in ego, but in alignment with values I had chosen for myself. I felt the presence of something larger than my individual existence, a connection to a continuum of effort and impact that transcended daily struggles. Every success of the foundation, every family empowered, every safe street and green space, became part of a larger narrative, one in which my actions had contributed to a lasting improvement of life around me. Observing the joy and relief on the faces of those touched by the work, I realized that belonging was no longer defined by social recognition or personal validation. It existed in the silent, steady knowledge that my efforts were meaningful and enduring. Each day was purposeful. Each decision, no matter how small, carried the weight of independence and intention. I measured choices not against how they would be perceived by others, but by their capacity to reinforce stability, opportunity, and dignity. The act of creation had become its own reward, a quiet affirmation that influence could be wielded without spectacle, that power could be exercised with subtlety, precision, and ethics. The harmony between action and principle became my compass, shaping both my external projects and my internal state. The city itself seemed to breathe differently under the quiet framework I had established. Streets once dangerous now felt like corridors of trust and safety. Empty lots transformed into playgrounds, gardens, and communal spaces. And neighborhoods became connected through the flow of opportunity, support, and shared care. The sense of accomplishment was not loud or visible. It was felt in the pauses between moments, in the rhythm of lives improving and communities stabilizing, in the knowledge that the structures I had put in place would endure beyond my direct involvement. On a late afternoon, I walked along down one of the quiet streets of the neighborhood I had helped shape. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over newly painted houses and freshly paved roads. Children played in the yards, their laughter pure and unscripted, unaware of the deliberate orchestration that had allowed their world to feel safe and vibrant. I paused to watch them, the wind carrying the faint scent of flowers and cut grass. In that moment, the past, the betrayals, the humiliation, the fear, felt distant and irrelevant. Nothing I had endured could compare to the weightless satisfaction of witnessing lives transformed. I realized that true victory had little to do with wealth, recognition, or influence. It lay in the ability to construct a world aligned with chosen values, to protect that world, and to act consistently in a way that upheld dignity, opportunity, and stability for others. Each step I took along the quiet streets reinforced my independence, my freedom from the shadows of old grievances, my alignment with the life I had deliberately built. The external trappings of success no longer mattered. What mattered was the enduring reality of creation, the neighborhoods that flourished, the people empowered, the sense of purpose realized each day. As dusk fell and lights glowed warmly from windows where families gathered, I understood the final lesson of my journey. Living without the need for approval, without the tyranny of status or recognition, I had found a life defined by deliberate action, ethical influence, and sustained impact. I walked past the houses I had helped restore, the community thriving around me, and felt a quiet, unshakable satisfaction. My past no longer dictated my present, and the world I had chosen to shape reflected not what I had lost, but what I had intentionally created. In that stillness, I understood that the truest form of victory was not in what others saw, but in the deliberate, enduring world I had constructed with my own hands and vision.